The bridge, a globally recognized emblem, is actually part rail/road bridge and part corridor that spans the Oresund, or the Sound, between Denmark and Sweden. It was finished in 2000, but it has a long and complicated history. It is an emblem of several factors, some of which are diametrically opposed. Nordic cooperation in the economic system and engineering, as well as the resolution of particularly gruesome, either real or imagined crimes, freedom of movement, with thousands of travelers traveling both ways on a daily basis, and more recently, policed boundaries with affiliated identity inspections, irrespective of one's viewpoint. It is an indisputable connection point between continental Europe and the rest of the Nordics, as well as a symbol of cross-border relationships. The bridge's entrance to traffic in 2000 had a significant social and economic effect on both Denmark and Sweden. The 10-minute ride prompted a lot of mobility in the flow of people, goods and services. The daily commuter population increased from 3,291 in 2000 to 18,000 in 2010. The link has created new opportunities. For example, in 2005, many Danes moved to Sweden to escape Denmark's skyrocketing house prices and commuted to work every day. Due to a labor shortage in Denmark in the mid-2000s, Danish employers began hiring Swedes. Even the 2008 economic crisis had little effect on the number of commuters. The increased number of refugees in 2015, on the other hand, served as a stark reminder that the Oresund Bridge remains a physical border between the two states, with many refugees preferring to apply for asylum in Sweden rather than Denmark. Many of the 163,000 applicants heading towards the Oresund Bridge passed through Denmark and were initially registered here rather than in Sweden, under the Dublin rules. The Danish government was outraged when the Danes decided to suspend registration in September 2015, and Swedish police have been checking traveler identification on trains and buses crossing the Sound since December 2015. Due to security concerns, the Danish police implemented border controls once more in late 2019. Travel on water outweighed rail connections in the 19th century. Prior to the 19th century, the Sound was most obviously characterized as a militarized border, with the exception of some periods of peace between Denmark and Sweden. However, the following Treaty of Kiel in 1814, which ended the Napoleonic Wars, the steamboat Caledonia began regular trips between the Malmö and Copenhagen in 1828. The first plans for a fixed link across the Oresund date from the second half of the 19th century. Following the Industrial Revolution, technological advancement and copious investment in engineering education in the Nordic countries demonstrated that realizing such a titanic enterprise was feasible despite the enormous costs and the modest benefits. However, sea transportation triumphed over new technology because it remained the most convenient, cost-effective and secure mode of travel and communication. The technological marvels of bridges and tunnels, lyricized by the engineers and businessmen alike in the 19th century, were not enough to discuss centuries of navigational expertise. With the invention of the train, the Sound, the Little Belt, and the Great Belt became the three major impediments to connecting the Scandinavian peninsula with continental railways. In 1865, Swedish engineer Claes Adelsköld proposed to King Carl XV of Sweden the construction of a train tunnel beneath the Sound. The Second Schleswig War and the lack of a fixed link from New Zealand to the continent were deemed sufficient reasons to reject the proposal at the time. Other similar projects, such as Rudolf Liljeqvist's underwater railroad tunnel between Elsinore and Helsingborg, 1889, were deemed either too costly or ineffective. Steam ferry lines remained the preferred mode of transportation for passengers, goods, and railway wagons, which were shipped on special ferries on the Trelleborg-Sassnitz route beginning in 1906. The car gave new impetus to bridge plans in the early 1900s. The automobile provided new impetus to engineers in the 20th century to mark the Nordic landscape with greater rail and road infrastructure. For example, the Little Belt Bridge, which connects the Danish regions of Funen and Jutland, was inaugurated in 1935. It had railroad tracks and 2 car lanes and a pedestrian sidewalk, and it brought the continent one sound closer. Gustav Evers and Tor Norda, 2 graduating engineers from Stockholm's Royal Institute of Technology, were the first to present a design for a 2-lane bridge connecting Elsinore and Helsingborg, 1935. However, large consortia frequently triumph over individual proposals. The following year, 6 engineering and construction titans from Denmark and Sweden, led by Danish engineer Rudolf Christiani, proposed 2 bridges: a combined rail and road bridge connecting Malmö, the island of Slotholm, and Copenhagen, and a bridge over the Great Belt. The proposal was rejected by both governments because the arms race of the late 1930s and the Second World War left no guarantee that the substantial investment would not be bombed. sooner or later effectively blocking navigation. The discovery of 16 unexploded bombs in the Sound during construction work in the 1990s demonstrates that their fears were justified. Proposals continued to be made from Nazi-occupied Denmark to neutral Sweden, but were rejected for similar reasons. A post-war vision of Nordic cooperation. The bridge is a physical manifestation of the Oresund region's transnational vision. Since at least the 1960s, local politicians, institutions, and entrepreneurs have imagined a region comprised of Zealand and Scania, as well as the cross-border cooperation and exchange that such a link would enable. However, the road to seeing the vision realized was long and winding. At its first meeting in Copenhagen in 1953, the Nordic Council stated that the construction of the Oresund Bridge was a primary goal for promoting intra-Nordic mobility and shortening the distance between the Scandinavian peninsula and the continent. In 1954, the two countries' social democratic governments formed a bilateral delegation to assess the technical and economic feasibility of the link. The delegation went on to obtain expertise from a wide range of scholars, for example, on traffic volume forecasts and analyses of the geological composition of the seabed, among other things. Simultaneously, bilateral teams of entrepreneurs and politicians from different cities competed to promote and advocate for their projects for a fixed link in the surrounding region. Their ambition was to become the new entry point to the Scandinavian peninsula, with all the opportunities that entailed. 9 proposals had already been submitted to the Oresund delegation by 1959. Despite these bids, getting conclusive answers to the delegation's many questions proved difficult, making it difficult for politicians to make a final decision in order for the project to be realized. Various societal groups were opposed to the project. Initially, Scanian farmers complained that as infrastructure and housing were developed, arable land would gradually disappear. Most vocally in the 1950s, the second factor, which was related to land use, was the rise of environmental consciousness at the end of 1960s. Several environmental organizations in Sweden and Denmark lobbied against land overexploitation, raising concerns about the effects of newly built infrastructure, overpopulation and traffic on nature, human health, and the quality of life in the Sound. Finally, the debate over the fixed link heightened tensions in Sweden between regional and national actors. The national government reminded regional actors in Scania on multiple occasions that an eventually fixed link was intended to meet the needs of international mobility, not just local traffic. The rise of more Bergwist parties in Sweden and populist parties in Denmark, both staunch opponents of this project in the 1970s, combined with the international oil crisis, further hampered agreement on the project. Because of these issues, the delegation's assessments had to start from the beginning nearly every decade since its inception in 1954. The vision for the Oresund region finally realized in the 1990s. Ratification of the project finally occurred in the early 1990s. Even so, the context was difficult. Denmark was in the grip of an economic crisis, and Sweden was mired in uncertainty over its EU accession. These tensions exacerbated the environmental protests against the project, which had been ongoing since the early 1970s, and contributed to the Oresund Bridge becoming a contentious issue. Nonetheless, the vision of the Oresund region and its economic potential prevailed this time. The hope of increasing bilateral trade and establishing the Sound as one of the main industrial, cultural, and touristic districts in Northern Europe eventually convinced Scania and Zealand's political and economic establishments to think in terms of region and cross-bordering cooperation, rather than as two separate countries. Filling the gap in the heart of the new region with a permanent link became critical to achieving this vision. The Oresund Bridge has successfully connected Sweden and Denmark since 2000. The Danish-Swedish thriller TV series, Bron 2011, has made the bridge a globally recognized northern icon. Its economic, societal, and cultural benefits appear to be unquestionable, especially when compared to other Oresund projects that have fallen by the wayside, such as the Oresund Committee and Oresund University. The bridge's history illuminates various societal visions, as well as intersecting local, regional, national, and international dimensions. Its real and imagined cross-border synergies mean that, while it remains a great feat of engineering and cooperation that makes a practical difference in people's daily lives, it also makes us think about state borders and freedom of movement, Nordic or otherwise.